Hello, everybody, and welcome to our LinkedIn Live. We're going to be talking about insights from our 2025 AI Ready Governance Report. I'm Bex Evans. I'm the Product Marketing Director for AI Governance here at OneTrust, reporting to you live from our New York office, joined by our Head of Privacy and AI Governance, Brett. Hey, Brett, how are you?
I'm good, Bex. How are you doing? I'm down here in Atlanta.
Nice to see you. Holding it down in our headquarters in Atlanta. We encourage engagement on today's session, so feel free to drop into the comments, give us a thumbs up, let us know where you're tuning in from. We love to hear from our audience. Really excited about this report today. Just to give a little bit of context on how this survey was conducted, we're going to talk a little bit first about who we surveyed. So we'll move to the first insight, just who we spoke to. First, we spoke to over 1,200 IT leaders across leading enterprises in Europe and North America. And we started to ask questions about the state of governance for AI in their organizations. So Brett, why now? Why was it important for us to survey the landscape at this point in time?
So, great question. So, really, there's a couple different things that are going on. Everyone is talking about AI, and everywhere you go, it's inescapable. And so, the more people are talking about it, the more enterprise is looking at ways to capitalize. You always have organizations that are looking to gain a first mover advantage to try and capitalize and generate market share. It's a lot harder to topple someone that already has market share and rather than coming in later with a more developed product. So everyone's talking about it, and I think now is really a good time to query people to understand not just what they're talking about, but how are they thinking about it? How does it create strategic advantages, and how does it create strategic risk? What are the types of governance that are needed to really make sure that if you're going to pursue AI strategies, that you're doing it in a way that drives the business forward, but also still supports your brand?
Yeah, I think you raised such an interesting point about driving the strategy forward, right? We're 2 years past this market explosion moment of Chat GPT kind of becoming mainstream. We've evolved from replicating old use cases with new technology to implementing new solutions and new use cases. And so AI not only changes what you govern, but AI is changing how you govern. And we see in the first insight from our report, this is having a massive impact on the teams that are tasked with managing AI risk. So if we pull up the next insight from our report, average time spent managing AI risk grew over 37% in the last year. 40% of the respondents state that they spend 50% or more of their time managing AI risk than they did in the previous year. So there's a large cohort are spending even more than the average there. It's particularly acute across teams that are using many tools, which we'll get into in just a moment. But my next question for you, Brett, is this a sign of stronger governance or evidence of inefficiency in current approaches?
I mean, there's a little bit of both. Really, when you think about it, AI adoption is kind of forcing a complete rethink of how organizations govern their data and their AI. A lot of organizations have legacy systems that can't handle the growing risks of AI, and it's creating bottlenecks, and it really stops the business from capturing AI value. I like to think of an example from if people remember back in the 1990s, Subway, the sandwich shop, sort of created this series of commercials where they branded their workers as sandwich artists. And this guy on his first day of work is coming in, and he's taking his time, and he's carefully crafting this sandwich, taking, the artist part of the title very seriously. And at the end, you see this beautifully crafted sandwich, and then you pan back and you look up, and there's a line of 30 people out the door, and they're waiting. And it's very clear that this process created a very lovely result, but it doesn't support the capacity that they need. And so I think this is a good analogy for what's happening with companies in AI right now. I mean, we see in the statistics that companies with more advanced AI adoption are spending double the amount of time than companies that are using one tool or in sort of the experimental phase. We also have governance teams, and they're trying to sort things out. And while there are compliance issues and sort of technical performance issues, it seems like there's a really heavy focus on cybersecurity. The more systems you have at play and the more opaque some of those systems are, the more risk you have around cybersecurity vulnerabilities. I think the number was 44% of the respondents said that cybersecurity vulnerabilities are the biggest risk from AI that organizations aren't really taking into consideration. And then, of course, you have others that are focused on shadow AI. There were specific sectors in the respondents, those from the public sector, education, agriculture, construction, that are really heavily focused on shadow AI. But if you take all this together, it really highlights the need for a big picture view. You need to have clear lines of ownership, accountability, and roles for each business team with clear linkages to a holistic top-down approach that allows for a cohesive and unified approach to AI governance. If you don't do that, one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to create a cycle where you are creating bottlenecks and that's slowing innovation, or you're just simply going to completely bypass governance and business teams are under obligations to get things out fast. And so either way, if you're not taking the right view, you're going to go too fast and create risk. You're going to go too slow and have bottlenecks. So it really does require a rethinking of how organizations are approaching data and AI.
Yeah, I think it raises this existential threat, right? Because no one wants to slow the business down, but we've seen time and time again headlines of organizations just getting this wrong, launching something without a considerations from the right stakeholders within the value chain, right? Going to their end users, going to their cross-functional counterparts who are driving and ensuring enterprise risk is managed, systems are upholding responsible values, right? There's a lot of different perspectives within the organization. And I think just coordinating accountability across the value chain, right? We talked about both the vulnerabilities with a third-party AI and shadow AI, and also trying to deliver and ship, if you're thinking about like a B2B context or a software, a solution provider, trying to ship new services and solutions and capabilities. It really, there's just different stakeholders involved. And I think if you asked every single one of those people in the organization if they cared about ensuring AI was used responsibly, they would say yes. But then if you ask them how they did that, you'd get a different answer from each person. And so I think it's great to have values enshrined. It's great to have principles that everybody can rally behind. But I think when it comes down to brass tacks, we have to think about what the processes and the standards look like and really ensure that we're holding folks accountable for their role that they play. So I want to move next to the next insight within our survey. And so this goes back to some of the demographics, right? We talked to stakeholders in North America and in the EU, and we saw that North America is leading AI adoption, 76% compared to 48% in the EU and 55% in the UK. Brett, what cultural or structural factors do you think explains this gap?
So I think there's a really big cultural component of this. If you look at the EU in particular, on the whole, they tend to be a more risk-averse culture. You typically see compliance as the initial approach. So it's compliance first, and in North America and US, it's more of a free market sort of approach. So if you think back, GDPR, privacy regulation came first in the EU. AI Act, the EU AI Act came first before the US started looking at this. And so what you get is you get this compliance first approach that tends to inhibit initial innovation. Companies are focused on compliance first and innovation later, whereas it's the opposite in North America, particularly in the US. We tend to be much more risk accepting, allowing free market competition to guide early frontier adoption and innovation. And regulation tends to come later. And in a lot of cases, it's more fragmented, where we're looking at it at a state by state level rather than federal legislation. We're seeing that both in privacy and AI. So what this ends up doing is it ends up giving US companies a bit of an advantage in having more freedom to innovate early And I think that's really where we're seeing this. The US companies are sort of staking their claim around innovation, and the EU or UK approaches are a bit more measured.
Yeah, I think that's a really important call out. And especially as we've seen sort of the Brussels effect early on with the GDPR passing, and we saw globally a rise of privacy legislation. We saw many laws in South America, in Asia Pacific, that largely mirrored language that we saw within the GDPR. We didn't really see a federal law come to fruition in the US, but we've seen this patchwork of state laws. And I think that's a foreshadowing of what we're seeing pan out with respect to AI legislation in the US. There's not really a Brussels effect taking place here for EU legislation. And I think globally, there is maybe a second thought around whether we want to prioritize innovation first or take a more risk-based approach first. So for more information on where we think that will go, you'll just have to stay tuned for our end of year predictions report, where we'll dive more into the state of regulation and where we think that's going. But we'll move next to our next insight around the study showing that the organizations that used many organizations used 4 or more tools to manage risk, privacy, and governance. I don't think this should come as any surprise. More AI means more risk and more governance challenges. And I think today's methods are really just a step from what we know, right? Taking our current processes and adapting them for the new technology. However, diving more deeply into that statistic, the report shows that 86% of advanced AI users claimed gaps in visibility, collaboration, and policy enforcement. And 90% of advanced adopters say that AI had exposed the limitation of those siloed and manual processes. And so I think there's a lot of experimentation going around to drive more synergy, more integration between these tools. I think that this fragmentation is just sort of an early stage, right? When we move into any innovation cycle, we first duplicate the way that we used to do things in the old paradigm. And then eventually our use cases, our methods for supporting them, they start to catch up. So Brett, my question for you is, how does this fragmentation actually slow down governance, and what are the implications for streamlining governance that helps to ultimately contribute to an ROI?
Sure. So 2 questions. First question, I think the number was roughly just over a third. It was about 35% of respondents were complaining that the lack of integration between their governance tools and their AI platforms is a primary challenge in enforcing AI governance at scale. The challenge here is that the fragmented systems can't really communicate effectively with each other. And so if they can't communicate with each other, then it's difficult to enforce AI governance across the entire organization. And if you don't have clear lines of visibility into how these AI systems operate, what data they access, what risks they generate, any governance effort really becomes reactive rather than proactive, and you end up constantly chasing your tail. So to your second question about streamlining governance to contribute to AI, I think one of the fundamental things that you're seeing is a rethinking of how governance operates. Traditionally, governance has come at the end. You implement something, you examine it, and then once it's operational, you then go and you apply governance to it. And I think what we're seeing now is leaders, at least those at the forefront, are really trying to think about how to build guardrails directly into the systems and processes where AI operates. This way, governance is sort of woven into the fabric of the AI development and the deployment, and it's not tacked on afterwards. Looking at some of the statistics, 98% of organizations indicated that they plan to increase their governance budget in the next year. And I think the average increase was just about 25%. And then governance budgets are expected to increase somewhere just under 30% for AI governance modernization. And those organizations that are a little further behind or a little trailing on that, closer to 20%. But I think the key is figuring out how your legacy systems operate, whether they're going to be sufficient, looking at the right systems, and then being able to embed the controls from the start. Because if you're going to operate at scale, you can't be operating where you're doing this in a modular approach.
Yeah, and we'll pull that stat up so folks can take the screenshots that they need, pass it along to their stakeholders. I know we're moving into budgeting season, and so that might be useful to pull that stat up on the 98% statistic that we found for an increase into governance budgets for next year, right? This talk about moving from, organizations typically make governance purchases after they invest in an AI or a technology solution, right? So how we can start to make governance a proactive investment rather than a catch up, I think it all goes back to business value and ROI. This is really a maturity journey where risk mitigation is kind of the value that we deliver. And if we can drive efficiency gains and speeds right now, showing that right now it's taking us 37% more time than it should than last year, and how we can start to give that gift of time back to the business stakeholders, right? We're talking about real people who are experts in building and shipping product. Like, they don't cherish filling out assessments. We're taking them out of work that drives more value to the business. So I think that's sort of the case to be made for this investment, is that yes, we're saving time and there's a labor efficiency gain associated with that, but we're also freeing up time to focus on driving value forward for the business. So we'll move to our final card on our presentation. And we're just giving a little bit, giving you a chance to access our QR code to download the full report for the 2025 AI Governance Ready Report, where you'll get all of the insights that we just shared with you and so much more. Insight into what are the key challenges, how different companies are approaching it, and all about helping you to make that business case if you need to drive a cross-functional team forward with your governance initiatives. So with that, we will wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us on this LinkedIn Live today. I had fun. Did you have fun, Brett?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for including me, Bax.
Thanks for joining me. We'll see you guys next time.